Today we are checking out the Fujifilm XF 18-55mm F2.8 to 4.0 R LM OIS lens, which is a standard zoom for Fujifilm X-mount cameras with APS-C sensors. It's often sold as a kit lens with some of the Fuji cameras, but it's also available separately for around $700 US. To view the most up-to-date prices, you can click the links in the description below. The focal length is equivalent to 27 to 84mm on a full-frame camera, which covers a wide range of shooting scenarios from landscapes to portraits. The maximum aperture varies from f2.8 at the wide end to f4 at the telephoto end, which is not very fast but still decent for low light situations and shallow depth of field. In this video, we will be doing some in-depth testing for sharpness, chromatic aberrations, distortions, image stabilization, alongside some other stuff. We'll start off with build quality. The 18-55 is made of metal and plastic. It feels solid and well built in the hand. It weighs about 330 grams, which is not very heavy but also not very light for a zoom lens of this size. The ergonomics and handling are very good, as it has a smooth zoom ring, a responsive focus ring, and an aperture ring with light clicks. It also has a sturdy switch to turn on or off the optical image stabilization, which we will talk more about later. It is not weather sealed, so you have to be careful when using it in harsh environments, alongside the fact that it does not have internal zoom, which means that the barrel extends when you zoom in or out. This can cause some front element wobble, especially at the telephoto end, and it's something I severely dislike on standard zooms. The filter thread size is 58mm, which is fairly common. It does not have any I/O ports for firmware updates or other functions, as it does this via the body of the camera. In terms of accessories, it comes with a plastic petal-shaped lens hood, which is good for reducing flare and protecting the front element from scratches or bumps. The lens hood can be reversed for storage. It's been a while since I bought this one, so I'm unsure if it arrived with anything other than the standard lens cap and rear cap, but it's pretty basic and nothing to be concerned about. The minimum focus distance of this lens is 30cm at the wide end and 40cm at the telephoto end, which is not very close but still enough for some macro shots or close-ups of small objects. The maximum aperture of this lens ranges from f2.8 to f4 depending on the focal length, which gives you some control over the depth of field and bokeh quality. The aperture ring has 1/3 stop clicks from f2.8 to f22. The focus ring of this lens is fly-by-wire, which means that it does not have a direct mechanical connection to the focus mechanism. Instead, it sends electronic signals to the camera to adjust the focus distance. The focus ring is smooth and accurate, but it does not have any hard stops or markings to indicate the focus distance. This makes it problematic for focus pulling in video. The autofocus performance of this lens is very good, as it uses a linear motor system that is fast and quiet. The autofocus is also accurate and reliable in most situations, even in low light or with moving subjects. It's slower than the 50 to 140, but that lens is at the higher end of Fuji's lineup. I bring this up because I personally find this a good combination, as its higher end counterpart, the 16-55, does not have optical stabilization, whereas this one does. The focus breathing performance is decent. As I've mentioned before, we see these characteristics as flaws, but they can always be used to enhance your story, so keep this in mind. The lens is not parfocal, which means that it does not maintain its focus when you zoom in or out. This is normal for most photocentric zoom lenses, especially those with variable apertures. Okay, let's take a look at the optical performance at 55mm. Overall, the image is pretty sharp, but there is some ghosting in the corners. As we stop down to f5.6, we see a slight increase in center sharpness and a big improvement in corner sharpness. At f8, there is very little improvement in the center and pretty good corner sharpness. At f11, we see the best optical performance with a clear image across the frame. This is, of course, right before diffraction starts to creep in and degrade the image. So, if you want the clearest image possible for a landscape, this may be your best bet. When stopping down to f16, you'll notice diffraction. And at f22, diffraction becomes very heavy, and I do not recommend shooting at this aperture unless it's for creative purposes. The image is incredibly soft. At 36mm, starting at f3.6, sharpness in the center is decent, with minimal ghosting in the corners. Stopping down to f4.0, there is very little improvement, and the corners are still pretty good. Dropping down to f5.6, we see a slight improvement in center sharpness and also a slight improvement in corner sharpness. Stopping down to f8, we see a slight improvement in both center sharpness and corner sharpness. The image looks very good. Down again to f11 with pretty decent center and corner sharpness. However, we start to see a tad bit of diffraction creeping in at f16. This diffraction becomes very heavy, and the contrast decreases at f22. The image is barely usable, with very soft edges in the corners and center. At 18mm f2.8, the center sharpness is decent, although it appears a little misty towards the corners, and there is a little bit of chromatic aberration. When we stop down to f4.0, there is a big increase in both center sharpness and corner sharpness, with the aberrations improving as well. At f5.6, we see very good center sharpness, although there are still some chromatic aberrations. The corner sharpness is good, but the same chromatic aberrations persist. At f8, the chromatic aberrations start to disappear, and the sharpness is very good, with the corner sharpness also improving. At f11, we see the best sharpness we've seen, but diffraction starts to creep in the corners. At f16, diffraction again becomes very heavy, and the overall image starts to lose contrast. At f22, the image is barely usable with a lot of diffraction, and it is overall very soft. In terms of aberrations, you'll find some heavy pincushion distortions at 55mm, and slight vignetting, which disappears at f5.6. The same goes for 36mm, although the pincushion distortions decrease a little. When zoomed all the way out at 18mm, there's some fairly heavy barrel distortion. However, all of these distortions are taken care of by basic in-camera corrections. So, without turning them off like you saw here, you'll never really notice any of this. The chromatic aberrations are not that well controlled, but they can also be corrected in post-processing or by turning on the in-camera corrections. Comparing it to the Viltrox 56mm, it has a little less chromatic aberrations, but still not as good as the Fuji 50-140. In terms of bokeh, the lens has a 7-blade rounded diaphragm that produces smooth and circular bokeh balls. The lens can create a nice separation between the subject and the background, especially at the wide end and at the maximum aperture. But it does not have a very shallow depth of field or a very creamy bokeh. It's also not very characterful, so it lends itself pretty well to more corporate work. However, I personally prefer something more interesting, like what you'll be able to get out of a vintage lens. If you'd be interested in seeing some tests on vintage lenses, I do have videos planned for this, so subscribe if you'd like to see that. The 18-55 has an optical image stabilization that can compensate for up to 4 stops of camera shake. The image stabilization is very effective for handheld shooting, especially at longer focal lengths or slower shutter speeds. The image stabilization can also help to smooth out some of the camera movements in video shooting, removing those micro jitters. This image stabilization is compatible with different camera models, but it works best with Fuji cameras that have in-body image stabilization, such as the X-H2S. The OIS and IBIS can work together to provide even more stabilization and better results. At 18mm, you may see a little corner wobble though, so watch out for this. It's not as bad as a 13mm, for example, but you should be aware that this can happen. So overall, it's probably the best kit lens you'll ever get, and over the years I've come to really like it. Now, my preference, of course, lies in primes, but it's a great way to start out and will last you for a long time. I would recommend this lens to anyone who is looking for a standard zoom in their Fuji X-mount collection, especially if they are beginners or casual shooters who want a versatile and easy-to-use optic. That was it for this video. If you liked it, consider checking out this video about the 50-140 from Fujifilm, which is a great telephoto to complement this one and make your focal range relatively complete.